What's up, everybody? This is George Samuels, and you are tuning in to Bitcoin Will Come, which is a special segment of the It Will Come show. And today we're going to be looking at how to understand blockchain as Google Docs versus Microsoft Word. So let's dive straight into it. Okie dokie. So, understanding blockchain as Google Docs versus Microsoft Word. Now, today's episode was actually inspired by an article that I read by Thomas J. Malik. The link is there, so if you want to check it out, feel free to just pause this video and copy that URL. But this particular section here, still confused, Google will help. And this was when he was actually talking about how to best explain blockchain in relation to Bitcoin. So, the easiest analogy to help wrap your head around the blockchain is Google Docs. In 2016, William Mugayer wrote an exceptional article explaining blockchain by comparing Google Docs to Microsoft Word. And so, there's of course that bit there, but I'm actually going to show you. All right, so today I'm going to go through specifically Microsoft Word, Google Docs, writing on a public ledger, what that looks like, what that means, and then how Bitcoin has used blockchain in relation to all this. So first of all, what is a blockchain, right? Now, there is, of course, the technical term. And typically, you will hear something like this. Bitcoin is based on a distributed ledger, or rather a specific kind of distributed ledger, a blockchain. Okay? And literally, a blockchain is a chain of digital blocks, right? It's pretty straightforward in its description of what they are. In each block, there is a set amount of data. And as the blocks get attached to each other, it creates a chain. So Bitcoin's ledger was the first blockchain, but the technology has begun to spread across the global economy. Hence why you may hear a lot of people just often use blockchain as the in buzzword. The reason blockchains let you keep thousands of strangers honest and consistent. Now, there's a caveat to that, but I will go into that. So the way I would often look at the blockchain is sort of this mosquito caught in, I forgot the name of the actual thing that the mosquitoes are caught in. And this, if you can guess which movie this is from, like, I'm going to give you 1,000 points, arbitrary points. But this scene here is from the movie Jurassic Park. And there's a mosquito caught in some ember, something like that. And essentially, right, in order to get to the mosquito, you have to dig very, very deep into it, right? And it's just frozen in time. And blocks in a blockchain are similar to this, right? It's just that in order to dig deep into the data, right, say if you wanted to hack into it, it would be very costly, it would be very timely, okay? So unless somebody has the resources to do this and the time, then they would think twice about it. So, the old way of writing. So if for all of you who are still using Microsoft Word on your desktops, right, then you might remember there was a time where a lot of document collaboration meant multiple versions of the same file being held in all over the place, right? And it made it very difficult to be able to see who was doing what, which one was valid, which one was the right version of that doc, because it was being held everywhere and there was no way of validating who was holding the most up-to-date piece without using some sort of naming convention, etc., right? And this eventually, did become a problem until Google managed to come up with live editing, all right? And what this meant was that people were able to now view the same document and see all the changes that were taking place by multiple people and go from there. And this was a huge leap in terms of collaboration for a lot of people, but it was only made possible with the internet, right? The internet allowed people to be able to live edit, collaborate in real time, and also move away from sort of the old clunky way of collaboration. And so writing on a public ledger is right, and looking at the public ledger as a description for a blockchain. And generally, when it comes to blockchain, you want the ledger to be public. That's how it sort of derives its security and its ability to be checked. Okay, similar to having an open doc for all collaborators in Google Docs. All right. Now, the interesting thing is, as you can see in this sort of animated image, is that with each block, what's being stamped is sort of the date and time, and then also the data contained within each block. Okay, this is the equivalent of sort of the version history within Google Docs. All right, so every time an actual change is made, it's timestamped. That version is there for everyone to see in the version history, and yet you can still see people, if they are live collaborating on the doc, what they're doing. In the blockchain world, and specifically more with Bitcoin, which was kind of the first to really popularize blockchain, right? With Bitcoin, you can see as a public ledger all the transactions that are currently taking place in the world. This is the equivalent of people all, writing on the same ledger, right? And so people are trading, yada, yada, yada. But their identity, they have the option to either make it public or private. Now, it's not completely anonymous because you can still see the transactions, right? And this is an important point to make. And with this, when it comes to the world of money, it's a very, very important thing to have, because it reduces anonymity, which, with anonymity, it obviously means that there can be a lot of shady things that take place. And if you need to go and investigate, right, the truth of a matter, it's much harder when things are anonymous. Now, in a sort of Bitcoin world, all of this works only if everybody sort of plays to the same rules. And as we know, not everybody likes to play to the same rules. But me personally, I think that for at least the money side of things, this is very important, that if both governments and the people can use a public ledger, then it means accountability on both sides, in which I think people would be they'd be more comfortable, right, to the idea of having their transactions, public but private, knowing that the checks and balances could happen both ways between government and its people. Okay, remembering, right, in a Bitcoin world, it's meant to be private or pseudonymous as opposed to anonymous. And the benefit of that from a security standpoint is that we don't have to actually spend a lot of money and extra resources and whatnot trying to deal with the sort of fallout of not having that there in place. Because I know a lot of people do get very worried about a world where everything is tracked. But have a think, if everything is tracked, but people have the ability to keep one another accountable both ways, right? And having sort of the mechanisms or the ability to still keep things that are personal and private to you private, right? Unless, by law or something, you're forced to have to share those things. You still at least have control and ownership over your own data. And that's the big thing here. Right now, there's obviously a lot of issues around privacy and ownership over our own data. In sort of a Bitcoin world, if everything is made into transactions, well, the ideal, right, would be that there's more accountability and it would encourage more honesty. But as we know, human beings, there's a bit of yin and yang. With every rule, there's an exception. Okay, and also there's many unintended consequences with any sort of technical innovation. Okay, so how Bitcoin used blockchain? So I think a lot of people, and when I say a lot of people, I'm talking about right now in the industry in which I find myself in. Blockchain is definitely the buzzword. A lot of people talk about blockchain, but they don't really understand what it is or what it does. And this is evident in sort of the number of projects that are happening in the world and have happened, which have kind of failed to show the real power of a blockchain. And I believe this is because we kind of look at it as a feature as opposed to what it kind of should be in a Bitcoin world, which is a plumbing system. And in a plumbing system, it's something that is actually quite simple, right? Blockchain on its own is not that fabulous. It is essentially a glorified database, and in some use cases, actually quite a lot, it isn't that great and it isn't that much better than a normal database that you would find, just using a table, right? And that's because Bitcoin used blockchain as part of a larger system, right? And that larger system was using sort of economic incentives to be able to solve another problem, which is known as the Byzantine's general problem, the Byzantine generals problem, right? And because of this, right, this is a problem that had been unsolvable for a long time. It created a new wave of understanding. And what's really interesting is if you're watching this for the first time, in the Bitcoin world, there's still quite a lot of misunderstandings and also a lot of politics, which means Bitcoin actually has sort of three versions that it's testing out on itself, which includes BTC, which is what most people know, BCH, also known as Bitcoin Cash, and BSV, also known as Bitcoin SV. And so blockchain is on its own is not necessarily the prize. And I think a lot of people are discovering that or finding that out the hard way. But I can understand because people kind of wanted to create their own money. So that's why they just extracted out blockchain and said, we're going to create our own thing. The idea in the early days with Bitcoin was that Bitcoin would be a contender to sort of other things that are already in existence. But we've essentially made things worse in the cryptocurrency markets, because instead of having sort of one cryptocurrency, if you want to call it that, or one blockchain, we now have multiple, which reduces sort of the value of a single public ledger, which is what Bitcoin was trying to do. So remember what I was talking about with rules, right? Sort of certain things cannot work unless people play by the rules, right? There are sort of, we have rules with cultures, we have rules in society, and the reasons why they work is if people actually agree to them and play by those rules, right? So we're still in very nascent early days, years, and we will see, sort of how that plays out. Got some weird stuff going on. There we go. So yeah, when you hear sort of the word blockchain, just know that it is definitely hyped up. It is a buzzword. It's used, I think, way too much without much understanding of it. And so it's important for you to try and do your own research. And I hope that today's explanation helps you with your understanding of what it is, what it's capable of, and what its strength was, and then why specifically Bitcoin made it useful. Okay? And so with that, did this help with your understanding? Is this something that allows you to get a greater grasp on what a blockchain is? Comment below. Remember to like and subscribe. The Bitcoin Will Come show. It is a separate channel from the It Will Come show. So if you only want to be tuning into sort of Bitcoin or blockchain related insights, then just subscribe there. And with that, let's just have a look. I think I heard someone commenting. Aha, okay, so we do have a comment. So give me 1 second. All right, so we got a question here. Do you think governments would be willing and open to be held accountable for their transactions and data? That is a very, very good question, Nikki. My opinion on that is, no. And I think this is why we see some of the issues that we do, because as you know, all governments have their sort of secret agencies, and many governments currently have the ability to print money at will. At the end of the day, it's money and power. But I kind of equate to the possibilities of blockchain, or at least a single public ledger, being used to both the internet and also to Slack. So from the internet side, it did start off with universities, and then government for government use, and eventually it became something that was used in the public domain. And so that's evidence of something that has started out private and maybe just government owned, to something then that became larger than that they were able to sort of handle. With Slack, the reason why I use that sort of comparison is because Slack's growth and adoption really started at a grassroots level first, and then it expanded into enterprise and made its way into the C-suite, right, into leadership. And because so many developers and people were just using Slack, it was very difficult for these larger corporations, these larger businesses to say no, right? Because it was so useful, it was helpful. So this is the approach I hope that we can have with something like Bitcoin, or at least a single public ledger. Is that, if there's enough utility or enough usage, then over time that becomes the thing that forces, in an indirect manner or way, people to actually adopt it, right? Like with anything, if it's useful and people use it, then it will grow naturally. But of course, it needs to be based on solid foundations, because otherwise you have a whole bunch of adoption and then it just falls on itself. So a little history, back in 2017, there was adoption taking place with Bitcoin. And at the peak in December of 2017, Bitcoin technically was not, well, actually, what happened was there was a group that had sort of put a self-imposed limit on BTC, which meant that when transactions filled up the Bitcoin blocks to a certain level, it was costing people $20 to send $5, which makes no sense, right? And this is what then ended up causing sort of the proliferation of multiple blockchains. People said Bitcoin doesn't work. They then took the blockchain side of things and created their own cryptocurrencies and said, hey, since that doesn't work, we will try creating our own thing and see if we can do better, right? Nothing stopped people from doing that, but that wouldn't have happened if some of those self-imposed limitations had taken place. And it came down to, sort of a misunderstanding, right, of sort of the Bitcoin tech, putting in limitations that weren't necessarily needed, and then building a narrative around Bitcoin being digital gold as opposed to something that has utility. And I think that is what crippled it, and I think what continues to. But there are some things happening in the background. So hopefully, that is what becomes, or at least what helps turn the ship around, right? But I'm still estimating about 10 to 30 years. But thank you very much for that question, Nikki. And with that, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And as always, as I always say on the It Will Come show, remember, through patience and persistence, it will come.